Welcome, dear listeners, to Family Shadows, a place where stories of fathers, children, and the ties that bind them come alive. These are not just tales of conflict. They are lessons carved out of silence, dignity, and the quiet strength of men who built their homes, their families, and their legacies with calloused hands and patient hearts. If you find meaning in these journeys, if they remind you of your own father or perhaps of yourself, then I invite you gently to join our growing family here. Subscribe, share your thoughts, and stay with us because every story you hear is more than just entertainment. It's a reflection of who we are when tested by love and respect. Now, tonight's story carries a title that feels almost like a challenge. My son-in-law stormed into my mansion with friends, so I taught him a lesson. Let us begin. Edward Hayes was not a man who sought grandeur, though his life had earned him a mansion that stood like a sentinel above the rolling hills of Connecticut. At 62, his gait was slower than it used to be, but his eyes, steel gray, sharpened by years of building a woodworking business from the ground up, remained steady. He had buried his wife, Lydia, 10 years earlier, and since then the house had felt more like a museum of memories than a monument to wealth. Every hallway still held her presence, the delicate curtains she had chosen, the oil paintings they had collected on modest trips before the money came. Even the staircase, polished to a soft glow, reminded him of the many mornings Lydia had walked down carrying a basket of laundry, humming under her breath. To Edward, the mansion wasn't just property. It was history, his family's sanctuary. And that was why, on that particular Saturday afternoon, the sound of heavy footsteps and raucous laughter at the front door did not just surprise him, it cut through him like a blade. The door burst open without so much as a knock. Jason Miller, his son-in-law, 35 years old, ambitious in career but careless in manner, strode in first. Behind him trailed 4 friends, all young men dressed as though they were stepping into a nightclub, not a family home. Their sneakers squeaked on the marble floor. One of them whistled low at the vaulted ceilings. "Man, Jason, you weren't kidding," one of them said. "This place is insane. You could fit my entire apartment in just the foyer." Jason grinned, broad and unbothered. He wore that smile often, the kind that suggested the world existed for his enjoyment. "Told you," he said, dropping his leather jacket carelessly onto the antique bench Lydia had cherished. "This place is huge. My father-in-law hardly uses half of it." Edward stood at the bottom of the staircase, his hand still resting on the polished oak banister. His heart sank at the sight, but he said nothing. Years of being a father, and now a widower, had taught him the power of silence. Jason noticed him finally and waved as though acknowledging adornment. "Hey, Dad," he said, casual to the point of insolence. "We're just gonna hang out here for a bit. Hope you don't mind." "Hope you don't mind." The phrase hung in the air, mocking, because of course Jason did not ask. He assumed, he declared. The group fanned out quickly, like tourists in a palace. One of them tapped on the grand piano in the sitting room. Another marveled at the wine cabinet. Jason himself strolled straight into the living room, turning on the surround sound speakers and queuing up music loud enough to shake the chandeliers. Edward's jaw tightened. His mansion had always been a place of quiet dignity. Even in Lydia's laughter, even in family gatherings, the house carried an air of respect. And here in broad daylight, it was being treated like a playground. Edward's daughter, Emily, appeared a moment later. She was 32, Jason's wife, and in that instant she looked every bit the daughter torn in 2 directions. Her voice was soft, tentative. "Jason," she whispered, tugging at his sleeve. "Maybe this isn't the best idea." Jason waved her off. "Relax, Em. Dad's cool with it, aren't you, Dad?" He turned toward Edward, grinning, raising his eyebrows as if daring him to disagree. Edward did not reply right away. He studied the scene, 5 young men scattering through the rooms, one pulling out a cigar on the back patio, Jason already pouring whiskey into crystal glasses Lydia had once insisted were for special occasions only. A storm brewed inside Edward, but outwardly he remained still. To the untrained eye, he might have seemed indifferent, but in truth he was measuring every word, every action, every boundary that was being trampled. "Jason," Edward said finally, his voice calm but carrying the weight of command. "This is not a bar. It's my home." Jason laughed, clinking his glass against one of his friends. "Come on, Dad, don't be so uptight. You've got more space here than you know what to do with. Might as well let it get some use." The friends chuckled, emboldened by Jason's bravado. Emily lowered her gaze, guilt flickering across her features. Edward turned away, not out of weakness but out of restraint. He knew what Lydia would have wanted, patience, at least in the beginning. He climbed the staircase slowly, leaving the chaos below him, but every step echoed with the same thought. Respect is not given. It is taught. From upstairs, Edward could hear the muffled thump of bass reverberating through the walls. He paused at a framed photograph on the landing, Lydia in her garden, sunlight in her hair. She had been his anchor, the one who softened his stern edges. Without her, he sometimes feared his silence would be mistaken for surrender. But Lydia had also taught him this. "Edward, when the time comes, you will know how to remind them what matters." And Edward, standing in his own house while strangers drank from his glasses and laughed at his expense, realized that the time was drawing near. The invasion had begun. The lesson would come. The music downstairs swelled louder as the evening stretched on. Edward lingered by the landing for a while, listening, his hand pressed against the smooth wood of the banister. He could hear Jason's voice rising above the others, boastful, careless, as though he owned not only the air but the very walls that contained it. At last, Edward descended again, not because he wanted to join them, but because a man must defend the sanctity of his home, even if only by his presence. He entered the living room and found Jason sprawled on the leather sofa, one leg crossed over the other, glass in hand. His friends lounged carelessly across Lydia's rugs, their laughter spilling across the room like broken glass. Jason spotted Edward and lifted his glass. "Dad," he said, grinning wide, "you should sit, have a drink with us. This is what this house needs: life, noise, a little fun." Edward's lips pressed together, but before he could respond, one of Jason's friends chimed in. "You know, Jason, if this place were mine, I'd throw the craziest parties. Pool in the back, music blasting. You'd be the king of the neighborhood." The others laughed. Jason leaned forward, seizing the moment. "Exactly. That's what I've been telling Emily. We could make this place ours. Think about it, Dad. It's too big for one man. You should let it go, let the younger generation make something of it." Emily stood in the doorway, her fingers twisted in the hem of her blouse. Her eyes darted from her father to her husband. "Jason," she whispered, but he ignored her. Edward looked at him evenly. "This house," he said, his voice low, "was built on respect. Every corner, every stone, every nail has meaning. It is not a playground, and it is not yours to claim." Jason laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "Respect, Dad, with all due respect, respect doesn't pay the bills. Look at this place. How much does it even cost to keep it running? Property taxes, maintenance, repairs. It's wasted on one man who spends his nights in silence." He spread his arms dramatically. "This house needs people. It needs energy. It needs me." The room fell quiet, save for the hum of the speakers. The words struck like ice against Edward's chest, not because they carried truth, but because of the contempt dripping from them. One of the friends, emboldened by Jason's tone, added, "He's right, sir. You should be proud Jason married your daughter. He's got vision. He sees the potential." Edward turned his eyes toward the young man, sharp as a blade. The friend faltered, shifting uncomfortably under the weight of that gaze. Jason, however, only smiled wider, as if he had won some small battle. "Dad," Jason said again, softer now, but still with that smug assurance, "we're family. Eventually all of this will be ours anyway. Why fight it? Why hold on to something you can't even fully use?" Emily's eyes filled with something unspoken, fear, shame, perhaps both. She took a step forward, her voice trembling. "Jason, stop. This isn't the way." But Jason waved her off, dismissive. It's just the truth. Someone's gotta say it." Edward drew in a slow breath. He could feel Lydia's presence, as if she were standing behind him, urging him not to lash out, not yet. He let the silence stretch, long enough that Jason shifted slightly in his seat. When Edward finally spoke, his words were steady, almost gentle, but they carried the weight of generations. "Jason," he said, "you confuse noise with life. You mistake ownership for love. This house has given more life in its silence than you will ever understand." Jason's smile faltered for the briefest moment, but pride quickly masked it. He lifted his glass again and muttered, "Maybe silence isn't all it's cracked up to be." The friends laughed once more, though less confidently now. Emily bit her lip, her hands trembling. Edward turned away, unwilling to waste more words in a room where respect had already been abandoned. He walked toward the staircase, his footsteps deliberate, his shoulders squared. Behind him, Jason's laughter rang out again, louder this time, harsher, like a hammer striking against the fragile glass of family bonds. Edward did not flinch. He climbed the stairs once more, knowing the storm was not over. It was only gathering strength. Night came heavy over the mansion, though inside the walls it was anything but quiet. Laughter spilled down the corridors like a trespasser. Music thumped against the wood-paneled walls, echoing into corners that had once known only the gentle hum of family gatherings. Edward sat in his study with the door closed, but even here the chaos bled through. He kept no glass of whiskey before him, no music to drown his thoughts. Instead, he had the comfort of Lydia's old leather-bound journal lying across his desk. It wasn't truly hers. Lydia had never been one to keep a diary, but it was the ledger Edward had maintained all those years in his woodworking business. Neat rows of numbers, notes on clients, reminders of deals struck. Lydia used to tease him for keeping such meticulous records. "You don't need to remember everything," she would laugh. "Life is more than columns and ink." But Edward had always believed otherwise. Life was the details, the patience it took to keep them, the trust it built when no one else was watching. Now, as Jason and his friends turned his home into an echo chamber of arrogance, Edward ran his fingers across the worn pages of the ledger. The steady ink reminded him of who he was and, more importantly, who he refused to become. Upstairs, the floor trembled with bass. Downstairs, he could hear Jason's voice rising above the rest, bold, brash, mocking. "Imagine," Jason said, his voice carrying up the staircase, "when Emily and I officially have this place. The pool will never be empty again. We'll throw gatherings every weekend. This old house will finally feel alive." The words, sharp as nails, drove into Edward's chest. He closed the ledger and leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the ceiling as if he could see through it, see Lydia, see her smile, hear her voice. "Edward," she would have said, "don't lose yourself in anger. Anger only burns you first." He remembered the way she had carried herself, firm but kind, her belief that people revealed themselves in time. And as much as Edward wanted to storm downstairs, to shout, to reclaim his home in a roar of authority, he did not. Instead, he waited. Patience had built this house. Patience had built his business. Patience would build his answer. Emily appeared at his door later that evening, her face pale, her eyes tired. She stepped inside without knocking, closing the door gently behind her. "Dad," she whispered, "I'm sorry." Edward looked at her for a long moment. She was his daughter, his only child, the one Lydia had cradled in trembling arms in this very house decades ago. He could still remember the night Emily was born, the way Lydia had whispered, "She's ours, Edward. She'll carry us forward." And here she stood now, caught between loyalty to her husband and loyalty to her blood. "It's not you I need an apology from," Edward said softly. Tears welled in Emily's eyes. She clasped her hands together. "He doesn't understand, Dad. He thinks this house is just property. He doesn't see it the way we do." Edward studied her face, the lines of worry etched into her young features. "And what about you?" he asked. "What do you see, Emily?" Emily hesitated, her lips trembling as though the truth sat heavily on her tongue but refused to emerge. Finally, she whispered, "I see both sides. I see you, Dad, and I see him, and I don't know how to make either of you happy." Edward rose from his chair, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. "It's not your burden to carry. Respect is not something I can beg from him. It's something he must choose to give. And if he will not, then he will learn it another way." Emily lowered her gaze, ashamed. "He doesn't mean to hurt you. He doesn't think." "That," Edward said, his voice firm but calm, "is the problem." From the hallway came another burst of laughter, Jason's voice loud and commanding. Emily winced, and Edward's hand tightened gently on her shoulder. "Go to him," Edward said. "Be his wife. But remember, you are still my daughter. And this house, Emily, is more than walls. It is memory. It is sacrifice. And I will not allow it to be mocked." She nodded faintly, her tears catching the light of the desk lamp. Then she slipped out, leaving Edward alone once again, with the echo of voices downstairs. For a long while, Edward stood at the window of his study, staring into the night. The garden stretched before him, shadows spilling across the trimmed hedges Lydia had once adored. The mansion loomed quiet around him, though its silence was broken by the clamor below. His anger was there, yes, but it was a silent anger contained like a storm held back by stone walls. And Edward, more than anyone, knew this. Storms, no matter how long they were held, eventually broke. By Sunday afternoon, the mansion no longer felt like Edward's home. It felt invaded, its air thick with the lingering smell of alcohol, cigar smoke that clung to the drapes, and the faint sticky sheen on the oak floors where Jason's friends had spilled their drinks. Edward had walked through it that morning like a man surveying a battlefield, his shoes crunching softly on a piece of broken glass, his jaw tightening as he picked up an overturned frame of Lydia's portrait. He set it back on the mantel, brushed the dust from its corner, and whispered into the quiet, "I won't let them turn this into a ruin, Lydia, not while I draw breath." But the storm downstairs hadn't ended. By mid-afternoon, Jason had returned, not just with the same friends, but with more. Emily followed reluctantly, her eyes darting toward her father with unspoken apologies. The mansion, built with quiet love and sacrifice, now buzzed like a cheap tavern. Edward stood in the hallway as Jason pushed the double doors open, swagger in every step. He tossed his keys onto the polished side table with a clatter. "Dad," he said, his voice booming as though Edward were a servant and not the man who owned these walls, "we're back. You should be happy. This place finally has energy again." Edward's eyes did not move from him. "It has noise, Jason, not energy." Jason smirked, brushing off the words. "Same thing." He clapped one of his friends on the shoulder, and the group scattered into the rooms like children claiming territory. One darted into the music room, pounding clumsy notes on the grand piano. Another rummaged through the kitchen, calling out in delight when he found bottles of wine. Edward's silence pressed against the chaos, but Jason, sensing it, pressed harder. "Dad, let's be honest here," Jason said, pouring himself a drink as though it were his by right. "This place is too much for you, too many rooms, too much space. It's wasted, but me, I see what it could be, a gathering spot, a statement, a future." Edward's gaze sharpened. "A future for who?" "For me and Emily," Jason replied quickly, confidently. "For us. Come on, Dad, you can't live here forever. You'll need to pass it on eventually. Why wait?" The words stung not because of their logic, but because of the coldness with which they were delivered, as though Edward were already half buried, his legacy up for grabs. Emily's voice cut through softly, trembling. "Jason, please." But Jason silenced her with a wave of his hand, never breaking eye contact with Edward. "You know I'm right. You built all this, sure, but what's the point of building if you don't let the next generation live in it?" Edward's anger, still silent, swelled like a tide. He stepped closer, his presence filling the room without need of volume. His gray eyes locked onto Jason's, steady and unflinching. "This house," he said quietly, "was not built to be a playground for men who have no respect. It was built with love, with sacrifice. And you," his voice hardened just slightly, "have not earned the right to step foot past the threshold, let alone speak of its future." Jason's grin faltered, but only for a heartbeat. Pride, arrogance, and the thrill of his audience spurred him on. He gestured toward Emily. "She's my wife. That makes this my future too." Edward turned to his daughter then, his expression softening. Emily looked stricken, torn between the man she had chosen and the man who had raised her. She shook her head, a tear sliding free despite her effort to hide it. Jason, sensing weakness, pressed harder. He raised his glass high, voice loud enough to reach every corner of the mansion. "Here's to the future, Dad, to what's coming, whether you're ready for it or not." The friends cheered, their laughter rising like smoke. Edward stood motionless, letting the noise crash against him. He did not shout. He did not demand silence. He simply watched, every line of his face etched with restraint, every breath drawn with the discipline of a man who knew patience could cut deeper than rage. But inside, something shifted. The line had been crossed, and Edward Hayes was no man to stand on the other side of that line forever. By the time night spread across the estate, the mansion no longer whispered of dignity. It groaned under the weight of intrusion. Lights blazed in rooms Edward had long kept dim, their glow spilling out onto the gardens where Lydia once planted roses. The fountain at the center of the driveway gurgled faintly, drowned by the pulse of music from inside. Edward had retreated upstairs, but only in body. His mind lingered on every sound below, the clink of glasses, the slam of cabinet doors, the hollering laughter of men who mistook volume for joy. It was not the noise alone that unsettled him. It was the utter disregard, the erasure of the house's soul, as though Lydia had never walked these halls, as though decades of sacrifice were no more than dust swept aside for a party. By 11 o'clock, The music shook the walls. Edward rose from his chair, slipped on the cardigan Lydia had once knitted for him, and walked downstairs. Each step was deliberate, measured, as though he were descending not into his own living room but into the heart of a storm. The sight that met him struck like a hammer blow. The grand piano's lid was open, sticky rings of spilled beer staining the polished surface. A man lounged across it, shoes scuffing the ivory keys. In the dining room, two others were snapping photos with their phones, posing with bottles from Edward's carefully kept wine cabinet. Jason stood in the center of it all, a glass raised high, Emily beside him, her face pale with silent shame. "To the future," Jason shouted. His friends cheered, their voices reverberating off the high ceilings. Edward stood at the edge of the room watching. He did not raise his voice. He did not step into the spotlight. He simply stood, a sentinel in the doorway, his eyes sharp and unyielding. One of Jason's friends noticed him and nudged the others. "Hey, look, it's the landlord," the man joked, earning laughter. Jason turned, spotting Edward, and his grin widened. "Dad," he bellowed over the music. "Come on, join us, this is your house. Well, soon to be our house. No better way to break it in than a real celebration." Edward's gaze swept the room. The rugs Lydia had chosen from a small antique shop in Vermont were dotted with stains. The crystal chandelier trembled faintly from the vibrations of the music. Even the family portrait above the fireplace, a painting of Edward, Lydia, and a young Emily, seemed to look down in sorrow. He stepped forward. His voice, though calm, sliced through the noise. "Turn it off." Jason blinked, then laughed. "What?" "The music," Edward said, steady as stone. "Turn it off." For a moment, silence rippled. Then Jason shrugged, amused. "Relax, Dad, it's just one night. You can handle one night, can't you?" Edward's eyes narrowed, not with rage but with resolve. He crossed the room, each step echoing in the sudden hush that fell as his presence pressed on the revelers. He reached the speaker, pressed a button, and the music died abruptly, leaving only the soft hum of electricity and the uneven breaths of those watching. Jason's face darkened. "What do you think you're doing?" Edward turned to him. His voice did not rise, but it carried the gravity of a gavel. "Enough." Jason scoffed, spreading his arms. "This is ridiculous. You can't control everything forever. This house is too big for one man stuck in the past. You should be thanking me for giving it life again." Emily's voice cracked, desperate. "Jason, please." But Jason silenced her with a glance. His pride had taken the reins now, and he had an audience. He squared his shoulders, staring down Edward like a challenger in a ring. "You think you can just shut me down? This isn't just your future anymore. Emily's my wife. That makes it ours." The words struck deeper than any shouted insult. Edward's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists inside his cardigan pockets. He could feel the storm pressing against the walls of his restraint, demanding release. His voice, when it came, was softer than anyone expected. "You mistake marriage for entitlement. You mistake inheritance for respect. And you mistake my silence for weakness." The room fell still. Even Jason's friends shifted uneasily, sensing the air had changed. Jason laughed, but it rang hollow. "Big words, Dad, but at the end of the day this house will be mine. You can't stop time." Edward stepped closer, so near now that Jason could see the steel in his eyes, the weight of decades carried in his shoulders. He did not shout, he did not strike, but his presence pressed so heavily on the room that the laughter died completely. "Time," Edward said, "does not give you what you haven't earned, and neither will I." Jason faltered, his smirk trembling, but pride forced him to hold his ground. He raised his glass in defiance, his voice trembling on its edges. "Then maybe you'll have to watch me take it." The glass clinked against his teeth as he drank, the sound sharp in the silence. Edward did not move, but in his stillness, in his unwavering gaze, the lesson had already begun. The party dwindled near midnight, though not because Jason wished it. His friends, sensing the shift in atmosphere after Edward's last words, began excusing themselves one by one. Their laughter had grown brittle, their bravado chipped away by the silent weight of the man who stood in the room without raising his voice. By 1 o'clock, the house had emptied of strangers. Jason and Emily remained in the living room, the glow of scattered candles flickering against the mess left behind, half-empty glasses, a broken vase, stains darkening the Persian rug. Edward said nothing as he passed through. He simply gathered a dishcloth, cleaned the spill near Lydia's portrait, and set the frame upright again. His silence was not passive. It was deliberate, like a craftsman measuring wood before the first cut. Jason slouched on the sofa, swirling the last of his drink. "He thinks he can scare me," he muttered, more to himself than to Emily. "He's just a lonely old man holding on to the past. Once he's gone, this house is ours. That's how it works." Emily's voice trembled. "Jason, please, you don't understand him. He's not like other men." Jason snorted. "He's just a man, and men get old. Men fade, property changes hands, it's the way of things." Edward heard every word as he walked upstairs, but he did not argue, not tonight. He had already decided. In his study, he sat at his desk and pulled out a folder he hadn't touched in years. Inside were documents carefully preserved that detailed the trust he had set up long ago. Lydia had been the one to insist. "Edward," she had said one spring morning when Emily was still a teenager, "this house has to stay whole. It can't become a bargaining chip. Promise me it will always remain a home." And he had promised, quietly, faithfully, as he always did. Now, leafing through the yellowed pages, Edward felt the steadiness return to his hands. The trust was ironclad. The house belonged solely to him, with provisions to protect it long after he was gone. No signature, no argument, no demand from Jason could change that. He picked up the phone and dialed a number etched into memory. It rang only once. "Carter," came the voice on the other end, steady, professional. "Henry," Edward said, his voice calm. "It's time." A pause, then a knowing sigh. "I always wondered when you'd make that call. I'll bring the papers tomorrow morning. Same terms." Edward glanced around his study, the shelves lined with books Lydia loved, the window that overlooked the garden, the worn chair where Emily had once sat as a child, asking him about the stars. He felt the weight of it all, not as a burden but as a responsibility. "Yes," he said firmly. "Same terms, but I want it made clear. No one, not even family by marriage, has rights to this house unless I grant them." "Understood." Edward hung up, his heart steady. For the first time in days, he allowed himself a deep breath. The storm downstairs had threatened to tear away what he held most dear, but Edward had not built his life on fear. He had built it on patience, on foresight, on promises kept. He closed the folder, slid it back into the drawer, and locked it. The key he kept on a chain around his neck, hidden beneath his shirt. Downstairs, he could still hear Jason muttering, Emily's soft sobs trying to calm him. But Edward knew the tides had already shifted. The son-in-law might believe he was winning, but the lesson was already in motion. Edward stood by the window once more, staring into the dark. The mansion loomed around him, scarred tonight by disrespect, but still standing, always standing. "Patience," he whispered into the night as though Lydia could hear. "Patience and the right moment." And somewhere deep within, Edward Hayes allowed himself the faintest of smiles. The move had been made. The lesson was coming. The next evening, Jason returned to the mansion with the same swagger as before. His friends followed like shadows, loud and careless, as if last night's tension had never happened. Emily trailed behind, her shoulders drawn tight, her eyes rimmed red from a night of quiet tears. Edward was waiting. The house, though still scarred from their revelry, looked different tonight. Lamps glowed softly, the air smelled faintly of cedar from the logs burning in the fireplace. On the coffee table in the living room sat a neat stack of papers, a leather folder placed squarely in the center. Jason barely noticed. He flung his coat over a chair, poured himself another drink, and stretched out on the sofa. "Dad," he said, grinning wide, "you really should lighten up. Look around, this place is perfect for company. It's a waste keeping it like a museum." Edward did not answer. He stood by the fireplace, one hand resting on the mantel, his eyes steady. Jason lifted his glass. "You know, I've been thinking. Maybe we should start planning renovations. Open up the kitchen, redo the pool. This place could be the envy of the whole neighborhood." Edward's voice was calm. "You speak as though it already belongs to you." Jason smirked. "It will, sooner or later. You can't live forever." The words hung heavy in the room. Emily flinched, her hands twisting in her lap. Edward let the silence linger. Then slowly he reached for the leather folder. He laid it open on the coffee table, the rustle of paper drawing every eye in the room. "What's this?" Jason asked, frowning. Edward's gray eyes met his. "This," he said, "is the truth." He slid the top document forward, crisp legal pages, stamped and notarized. Jason picked it up with a mocking laugh, but as his eyes scanned the words, the smirk faltered. The friends leaned closer, curiosity piqued. Emily's breath caught as recognition dawned. "This can't be right," Jason muttered. "It says the property belongs solely to me," Edward finished, his voice firm. "And it always will. 10 years ago I placed this house into a trust. No one, no friend, no in-law, no opportunist has any claim to it. Not now, not ever." Jason's face reddened. "You can't just—" "I can," Edward interrupted, his tone cutting sharper than a shout. "And I did, long before you thought to swagger through these doors." The room was silent but for the crackle of the fire. Jason's friends shifted uncomfortably, exchanging wary glances. One of them cleared his throat. "Maybe we should head out." But Jason wasn't ready to surrender. Pride burned too hot. He slammed the papers back onto the table. "You think you can humiliate me? In front of everyone? You think a stack of old papers scares me?" Edward stepped forward, close enough that Jason could see the iron in his gaze. "This isn't about fear, it's about respect. Something you've yet to show, but something you will learn tonight." Jason opened his mouth, but no words came. His friends, sensing the futility, began drifting toward the door. One muttered an awkward goodbye. Another simply avoided Edward's eyes as he slipped out. Within minutes, Jason stood almost alone, the echo of his entourage fading down the hall. Emily's tears spilled freely now. She looked at her father, then at her husband, torn in two. "Dad," she whispered. Edward's eyes softened as he turned to her. "Emily, this house is yours to remember, not to lose. Your mother's love is in these walls. I built it for family, not for vanity." Jason's pride finally cracked. His voice, once booming, came out hoarse. "You set me up." Edward shook his head. "No, Jason, you set yourself up. I only allowed you to reveal who you truly are." Silence fell, heavy and final. Jason lowered his gaze, the fight drained from him. Edward turned away, placing the documents back in their folder. His voice, though quiet, filled the room with finality. This lesson isn't for your humiliation, Jason. It's for your salvation. If you cannot learn respect here, you will lose far more than a house. You will lose the people who call it home. The fire crackled on. Emily sobbed softly. Jason sat rigid, staring at the papers that had undone him, the lesson written not in anger but in law, in foresight, in patience. Edward Hayes had spoken without raising his voice, yet his message thundered louder than any outburst could have. And in that silence, Jason finally understood. The mansion was quiet again. The kind of quiet Edward had always cherished, the quiet of dignity, of memory, of a home kept whole. The echoes of Jason's arrogance had faded, carried out the door along with the last of his friends. Only the steady tick of the grandfather clock remained, keeping time as it had for decades. Edward stood by the fireplace, the folder of documents tucked neatly away once more. He did not feel triumphant. There was no pleasure in humiliating a man, even one who had shown such disrespect. What he felt instead was something heavier, but cleaner, like the stillness after a storm has passed when the air is sharp and clear. Emily approached him quietly. Her steps were hesitant, her shoulders trembling with the weight of what had just unfolded. She stood before her father, eyes glistening. "Dad," she whispered, "I'm so sorry, I should have." Edward stopped her with a gentle shake of his head. "No, Emily, this was never about you. You are my daughter. Nothing will change that." Her lip trembled. "But Jason has a choice to make," Edward interrupted softly. "He can learn respect, or he can lose what respect remains. That choice is his alone." For the first time that night, Jason spoke without bluster. His voice was low, stripped of bravado. I didn't understand," he admitted. His hands, once so quick to grab a drink or gesture wildly, now hung still at his sides. I thought it was just a house." Edward's eyes softened, though his voice carried the weight of truth. "It is never just a house. It is memory. It is sacrifice. It is the sum of every promise Lydia and I kept so that Emily could grow up with more than we had. You saw walls and windows. We saw life lived, love preserved." Jason's gaze dropped to the floor. Shame burned his cheeks. For once he had no retort. Edward placed a steady hand on Emily's shoulder. "This home will always be yours to remember, but only if it is treated with the respect it deserves. That is the lesson." Emily nodded, tears spilling freely now. She leaned into her father's embrace, and for a brief moment she was a child again, safe in the certainty of his arms. Jason stood apart, silent. Whether the lesson would take root in him, Edward could not know, but he had given it as every father must, not with rage, not with cruelty, but with the steady truth that dignity demands respect. The firelight flickered across the room, casting long shadows on the walls. Lydia's portrait hung above the mantel, her smile serene. Edward looked at it, and for the first time in many nights he felt peace. He had kept his promise to her. The house was safe. The memory was safe. And the family, though fractured, still had a chance to heal. Dear friends, thank you for joining us in this story on Family Shadows. These tales are not just about conflict, but about the quiet power of patience, dignity, and respect in our homes. May this lesson remind us all that what we inherit is not only houses or wealth, but values, the true foundations of family. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for sharing your time here. From our family to yours, we wish you good health, strong love, and lasting happiness in your home.